What in the world is happening in Afghanistan? That is the latest article published at righteouspeace.org. Please check it out to learn more about related articles, the peace process, transactional terrorism, the Afghan elections, and as well as domestic terrorism in the United States. Please check out righteouspeace.org and get to know more about them. As we're speaking right now, the U.S. government is on day 4 of their talks with the Taliban leadership in Doha, Qatar. Let's stop here. Why the U.S. government is speaking to Taliban leadership? Is it supposed to be an Afghan dialogue, Afghan negotiation, or Afghan peace talks? To clarify, there's no negotiation yet. These are all efforts and talks or pre-negotiation steps and process taking place that needs to bring the Taliban leadership to a state of negotiation with the Afghan government or Afghan representatives. So no negotiation yet. Anything about so far 8 talks in Uzbekistan, Moscow, Pakistan, in Doha, Qatar, everywhere that has happened so far and still happening, it's all efforts by the U.S. government, Afghan representatives, and international community or think tanks or organizations to bring the Taliban to negotiation table where they should have an intra-Afghan dialogues. So let's stop right here and let's talk about what is exactly happening in Afghanistan in addition to the peace process. I break it down into different categories. The first one is the Afghan government. The Afghan government are more in favor of election, and election has been fraudulent. It has come with a lot of corruption. It has come with a lot of problems, and it didn't work for 2014. As a result, the country almost went to a civil war, and it was a big chaos. Former Secretary of State John Kerry brokered a deal, brought the 2 presidential candidates, Abdullah Abdullah, a Tajik from Jamiat Islami party, and Ashraf Ghani, a Pashtun who was running independent, to a national unity government. And that national unity government has suffered and has failed miserably. Just look at the data and the statistics and the numbers of casualties. President Ghani mentioned it to CNN, 48,000 in the past 2 years of his term. 48,000 soldiers died. Just think about it. 48,000. That's a lot of people. It could fill a stadium of football. It's a lot of people. So like that, a lot of other problems and a lot of progress in educational sectors. So it has taken, but election didn't work that well in Afghanistan, and it has always come with a fraud. 2009 election, President Hamid Karzai and and the current chief executive CEO Abdullah Abdullah, they had problems, and there was a mass corruption and a lot of arrests take place by the Afghan security forces, people who got involved. So that's how an election has been. It's given the age of a democratic regime, it's not surprising. It's 19 years and it's all efforts and it's progress. It's just when a glass shattered, it takes years to put that back. Government is skeptical of the peace process. And let's give some examples why and what needs to be done. So a couple of reasons that could be is the President Ghani might want to stay in power, and he might see election as a base way to continue his policies that he has repeatedly promised to build Afghanistan, and he can build Afghanistan or things with his own policy in his campaign. That's like one reason. And the other reason is the Taliban trustworthy issues, and how you could trust the Taliban when they promise not to harm the civilians, and then a week later they target a wedding or suicide bombing in a congested area of the city, or target Afghanistan and security forces all over Afghanistan. That's another reason for the Afghan government that they are calling for the Taliban to have a strong stand on what they say. Other reasons could be personal issues between President Ghani and other political leaders, and how he has been skeptical of the peace process, and his running mate Amr al-Saleh has used the term useful idiots for political leaders that, including Hamid Karzai, that they went to Moscow and Uzbekistan and in Doha, and then have met with the Taliban leadership. So to fact check, they were political leaders. They have ruled over Afghanistan in 1990s, 80s, and even 2000s. And Taliban have repeatedly said that they would like to negotiate with the Afghan Mujahideen on the Northern Alliance, their enemies, because they fought together in 1990s, rather than the Afghan government. These political leaders, they see interim government a negotiated settlement, the peace process, the best option. And again, interest of each party matters there, and to them, this is the best option. First, to end the regime of Ashraf Ghani, the president of Afghanistan, and has ruled with an iron fist, and that's what New York Times, Washington Post call it, on his policies, on his stand policies against organized crimes, and at the same time for being ethno-nationalist, the term that described him on the Diplomat magazine and Al Jazeera, Reuters, and other big news agencies that they call for President Ghani for his ethno-nationalism, how he has isolated many political leaders from Afghanistan's major decision making. So the second one is the Taliban. So the Taliban are more in favor of speaking to a group of people not involved in the government. So what you're saying is that we want to have a role in Afghanistan, but it won't come through Afghan government. So this comes to the question of reputation. So the Taliban, remember, they ruled Afghanistan for 5 years, 1996 to 2000, when the 9/11 happened. The United States got involved and toppled Taliban, and President Karzai took over 2 consecutive terms, elections, and then President Ashraf Ghani, and to that brings us to the current date. So the Taliban did not want to work under the framework of an Afghan government. They want to be known as a government that ruled over Afghanistan. They had their own presidents, governors, provincial governors, and they had a constitution. The Taliban factor is tricky, and it's complex, and it's really hard, and it's really hard to predict, because in last Doha meeting, they promised to the Afghan representatives that they will continue to the peace process and not harm civilians and not target schools or congested areas. But they did it so many times after that talk. So that's another issue with the Taliban, is trust. How the Afghans could trust to the Taliban, the Afghan government, political leaders, the American government, and the public. What is one thing that they could get out of Taliban? Trust has been the biggest issue. But the Taliban has repeatedly rejected to speak to the Afghan government. They want to speak to the American government. The reason they want to speak to that government is because the American government removed them from power. But they want to speak to Americans themselves. And they say, like, yo, you removed us from power, and you need to put us back on power. So that's what exactly the Taliban are saying. We don't want to speak to Ashraf Ghani. We don't want to speak to other people. We want to speak to you. You're the one paying for the Afghan soldiers. You're the one supporting them, and you're the one who have a physical presence here. So they want, if U.S. troops withdrawal, they will speak to the American government. If they have a constitutional changes, they want to talk to them, and they want to have again in the government. They want to have that. They say, like, if you put President Ghani as the president, you have the power to put us there too. So it's a lot of talking to the master, not talking to the someone who, the term they call it puppets. You're not going to talk to the puppets. That's the Taliban's strong stand on that. Basically, the New Deal is working on how it could bring the Taliban on a table with demands to be heard and to be listened to. So that means the Taliban have certain things that need to talk about, whether it's Islamic Emirate, amendment to constitution, social norms, U.S. troops withdrawals, massive share in Afghan government. And when I call Afghan government, they want like a new government. They want an interim government, and through that election and stuff like that. And it has worked out pretty well for the blacklisted political leader, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, aka Butcher of Kabul. He was on the CIA's blacklist for years, and then a couple of years ago he was removed from that list, and now he's one of the running candidates for presidential election, which is a huge success. To money, he might be a butcher, but Afghanistan requires people to come together and compromise and unity and let them run. If they have done mistakes, this is the time to work on your country. So that is a possibility for the Taliban. If it worked for Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, a leader of Hizb Islami, a big party in Afghanistan, and it could work for the Taliban. So that's like one reason the elections might not be a better option. Negotiation settlements or negotiation with the Taliban, and through an intra-Afghan dialogue might be a better option. But again, that goes back to what Afghan wants, the President Ghani wants, what the other political leader wants, what the United States wants, and what and most importantly, what the Afghan wants. So basically, the Afghan government, the Taliban, political leaders, and the U.S. government. So the U.S. government is looking for a way to end the 19 years of war. Three living presidents, President Bush started, President Barack Obama surged and used every aspect of military options from counterinsurgency operations to a surge of 100,000 soldiers to combat terrorism, and it didn't work. And right now, the President Trump with the diplomatic efforts of negotiation. So that is an option for the U.S. government ahead of 2020 elections, and there are a lot of things happening. President Trump wants to get out of it, something out of this. A peace talk that happened to happen between the Taliban and the Afghan government as the result of U.S. efforts and regional actors, and that is not going to bring an absolute peace to Afghanistan. Let's be clear on that. There are over 22 insurgent groups operating in Afghanistan, including ISIS of Khorasan, Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, Al Qaeda, Haqqani Network. There's so many other individual fighters from different countries, from Chechnya, Dagestan, and Tajikistan, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, so many other countries. So that is a biggest problem. So a portion of the Taliban might be able to negotiate and just say we want to be involved in the government, but there are going to be one portion or more of them, along with all these other transnational terrorism, continue to be a struggle. And that is the next phase. If the deal and the peace process works, then that is next on the agenda for the U.S. Afghan government to work on that and how to get rid of that. So to wrap up, we talked about the Afghan government, what the Afghan government wants. Afghan wants an election, and election is in base favor of them to continue their regime and stay in power. The political parties in Afghanistan do want an interim government to first end Ghani's term, and second, be involved and gain power and have peace in Afghanistan. And it's the Taliban. They want to speak to the American government. They want to speak to the master. They want to speak to the Afghan government, and they have rejected it repeatedly throughout the years. And then we have the transnational terrorism. So in case of a possible peace, it's hard to predict it's going to bring an absolute peace because there's going to be always a transnational terrorism given the Afghanistan's location and history and interest of other foreign actors to keep in mind in the region, including Pakistan, India, and China, and Russia, and Iran. So there's a lot of countries that we need to focus on.